Welcome to the Dirtbag State of Mind podcast from the Climbing Zine. I am Luke Mehall, and this is our Season 8 premiere, a conversation with Chris Sharma, from Prodigy to OG. This one was super special for me. If I had to pick one climber in the world, it's my favorite, it would be Chris Sharma. Partly, I think, because of the era I grew up in when I started climbing in 1999. He was already a young climber at the top of his game, redefining sport climbing and bouldering and doing it with a vibe and a humility that still 25, 26 years later has made an impact on me. The other really exciting thing for the Climbing Zine is that we have released volume 26. This is our first, we're calling it an LCAP sized issue. Our previous issues maxed out at 100 pages. This one has 164. And holding it to me after doing this thing for 16 years, it feels right. It feels like this bigger format is where we're destined to go. And we're going to take it there. So we've got a lot of really incredible stories. You can score a copy or subscribe at shop.climbingzine.com. And we'll be doing some zine things across the country. And we'll be attending some festivals here this spring and summer as well, starting with the Red in a Day, April 10th and 11th out at the Red River Gorge. Our shipping manager, Zaz, is going to be there. So look for Zaz in the Climbing Zine booth and say hi to them and pick up a zine, pick up a shirt, maybe even type on our typewriter. All right, now back to Chris. Yeah, I really enjoyed this conversation with Chris, and that's just an understatement. And to me, as being a podcast host, you're curating a conversation, and I kind of went into the assumption that I knew what Chris was all about. But by the end, I kind of uncovered this different layer. He kind of presents himself as this chill person, but there's also this burning flame that he describes. And as we talk about his multi-pitch project that was actually chopped, and then he rebolted it according to quote unquote style that area preferred, I feel like I unlocked something that I didn't really know about him. So it was a good lesson for me to not make assumptions that just because people are famous and you know who they are, you know what they're all about. So that was the greatest joy in this conversation with my favorite climber of all time, Chris Sharma. This episode is sponsored by Patagonia. Patagonia is proud to announce the Free Wall Kit. 6 pieces to help you rest hard and climb harder on the most sustained multi-pitch objectives. Designed to meet the demands of their ambassadors' evolving tactics for cutting-edge multi-pitch objectives, the Free Wall Kit prioritizes protection and recovery so you can focus on performance. Each piece is built with features to make the most of marginal rest so you can get back just enough energy for the send. Check out the full kit at patagonia.com or in our show notes. This episode is also sponsored by Kilter. Looking for a fun way to train or at home or at the gym? Check out the Kilter board. Kilter board has innovative light-up holds, progressive app, and animated functions with climbs for all abilities and multiple layouts to choose from with large online communities for each. If you've been listening to our podcast for a while, you know Kilter has been a long-term sponsor, and now you can get a discount on a Kilter board by being a listener. There are flat rate savings. Larger the size, the larger the discount, ranging from $500 to $800 off. Use code ZINE at checkout, and this applies to North American customers only for the full ride, mainline, and auxiliary kits. For more information, check out settercloset.com and look in our show notes. All right, now without further ado, let's get into this conversation from Prodigy to OG with Chris Sharma. I just wanted to start the whole conversation off by just kind of, thanking you for being who you are within our climbing culture. I started climbing in 1999, and you've always been present within my climbing career. You've just always been this constant, for a very simple way to say it, just a good vibe within the climbing community.
I've had the full arc of experiences throughout, the 30-something years that I've been climbing. And, I got thrust into the limelight at a young age. And so it took me some time to make sense of it all. But kind of along the lines of what you just said, kind of the interaction between the broader climbing community and all of my, experiences. It's really kind of made everything that I've done feel a lot more meaningful, that somehow I've been able to contribute and, inspire other people.
Who inspired you originally within climbing? Where does your climbing journey start? And were there certain climbers that inspired you when you started your journey?
Well, I started climbing, 1993 in Pacific Edge Climbing Gym in Santa Cruz, California. And I had a lot of people around me that were, of course, inspiring, but I think the Masters of Stone movies were super popular at that moment. I feel like those things need to be brought back to life somewhere online or on social media. Like those were such classic, inspiring films. And so, yeah, like certainly at that early stage, watching those films, watching people like Boone Speed, and of course, when I got to know him, he became a big inspiration of mine. So Boone Speed, Ron Kalp, of course, when I was going to Waco, like Fred Nicole. Yeah, I mean, when I look back on it, I've had the opportunity to climb with so many of the original legends. Unfortunately, Wolfgang Gulick had passed away, a year or two before I started climbing. But aside from him, I feel like I've been able to climb with a lot of the legends, from back in the day. I mean, it was really interesting. I got to compete even with a lot of those guys, even though they were and had, much older than me. I started doing the national competitions when I was just 14. And then I was doing international events when I was 15, 16 already. So yeah, I had a chance to compete and climb alongside a lot of those original OGs from the early 90s. It's pretty neat to see the whole arc of climbing since then. It's incredible.
It's insane. Like I went back and watched Rampage a little bit, and it just looks so like vintage almost now. And in my mind, it's like, oh, it's this like cutting edge thing, and then you realize 25 years have gone by.
That was a special trip for sure. Looking back on it, and it's cool. Those guys are still all really good friends of mine. But yeah, I think looking back on it, of course, bouldering was up and coming. So you had people, of course, like Ron Kauk, and then Fred Nicole putting up hard boulders in Waco, and Ben Moon and Jerry Moffat and people like that. But I think, Rampage and some of their earlier films from Big Up Productions, like they definitely had a big influence in modern day bouldering, right? And popularizing that as a discipline in and of itself.
Yeah, totally. You mentioned that you were kind of thrust into the limelight within climbing, and I think there's a few climbers that are like that. I just interviewed Ashima, and it seemed like that was very much the case for Ashima. What was the moment where, was it someone else, or was it within you that you realized you were talented and quite skilled at climbing?
I was pretty skilled, like right away. Looking back on it, I had an insane trajectory of progression. I started when I was 12, and then by the time I was 15, I did the hardest route in the country, and I was already national champion and everything.
Smith Rocks, or what was that?
So it was Necessary Evil at the VRG. That same month, I went and I did Just Do It in Smith Rocks. And, the year prior, I had won the national championships and the youth world championships and all of that. And so, it's crazy, because for me now, 2 years doesn't feel like much. But it's especially when you're a kid. I mean, when I see my kids, watch them, you can see time passing in a different way. And looking back on those first years when I got started, it's pretty crazy to reflect on how fast my progression was. So it was from both sides. I mean, I was like incredibly motivated and hungry and talented. And then, I think when I started winning these competitions and then started doing the hardest routes, it was definitely like a turning point. It was a big paradigm shift in climbing. It wasn't just me, but it was me, Tommy Caldwell, Katie Brown, Beth Rodden. The four of us were really, it was this paradigm shift in climbing because we were the first kind of kids that came onto the scene that really kind of changed everything. It kind of flipped everything on its head in a way. And it's pretty interesting. I think for myself, Tommy was a climber from much longer. He had been climbing already for a really long time with his father, and it started in the mountains. But for myself, for Katie Brown, for Beth Rodden, we all started in climbing gyms. So we're really like the first generation of kids that got into climbing in a gym. And yeah, I think it just gave us this opportunity to, you know, I mean, I think what we're seeing now is like that, on another scale, because now there's so many gyms, there's so many people, kids that are doing it, that we're seeing this, insane pool of talent. And looking back on it, I mean, I started when I was 12. Like in today's world, that's almost like late in the game and get into climbing when you have kids that are already, 6 or 7 or whatever. So yeah, it's interesting and it's cool for me to always just kind of reinventing my relationship with climbing. I feel like that's the key to staying psyched and motivated all these years. You kind of have to keep reconnecting with it in a new way as you progress through your life in different phases. But it's pretty cool that climbing is like this thread that has connected so many life experiences and life lessons throughout my whole life.
You mentioned Tommy, kind of, there's those classic photos of him on Devil's Tower when he's like 4 years old or something. With trad climbing and mountain climbing, there's so much ethical debate, and there's so much like, this is the way it needs to be done. And like the Royal Robbins strict ethics versus the Warren Harding stuff. And then in the 90s, sport climbing came along, bouldering came along. It was all kind of blown up. Were ethics and the approach to a climb, was that something older climbers cemented within you, or were you pretty much just like, these are things I want to climb and I'm going to climb them?
I think it's an interesting point to consider. It came up in another podcast recently. Someone interviewed Tony Aniro, and he had mentioned that I had snaked one of his projects in Mount Charleston in mid-90s, a route called Hasta La Vista. And it was a red tagged project. And looking back on it, it's something I kind of regret. It was kind of a punk move to do. But I feel like on a bigger scale, every new generation has to kind of buck the norms in some way and challenge, in some way those norms. And so I remember in particular, some of the ideas of like closed projects. That was one of the things that was something that we were kind of challenging. Now looking back on that, having developed and bolted a lot of routes, I could say I have a different perspective on it too. Throughout my experience as a climber, I've had all sorts of life lessons and experiences along the way that, you look back on and, things you learn, things you maybe could have done. I think in that same way, if you look at the trajectory of climbing in general, whether it's the advent of, bolts or top-down bolting or, hang dogging or using chalk or anything new that comes into our sport, it's always going to be looked kind of frowned upon at the beginning. And so the new generation of pioneers, it's just a normal, I think, tension that there is in those situations where you have different generations and the evolution is going in these new directions. And yeah, that's just kind of part of it. And I mean, it's pretty neat to see, how climbing continues to evolve, right? And one of the things that I've always felt is that we do love to like categorize and quantify and try to qualify all of these different things in the context of a sport, right? But in the end, climbing is this activity that we do. It's an expression of freedom. And so for me, I think in the end, it's like, well, you do it the way that it feels best for you, right? Classic example, you might come to a boulder problem and it might have some scrunchy sit down start. And, for me, I was like, that doesn't feel like the obvious place I would like to start. I'm going to start over here. And in the end, it's like, you're free to do whatever you want, as long as you're honest about it, right? That's one of the beautiful things about climbing. Of course, it's great also to be able to compare, and the fact that it is a sport is a really cool thing. But I have to say, one of the things that attracted me at the very beginning and still to this day is that you can just go out and have your own experience, your own adventure, your own process, and it's very personal at the same time.
I want to go back to that red tag thing because I think that's an interesting conversation because people still use red tag as a technique to state that, that route is closed and someone's spending time on it. It could be for, safety reasons too. With this particular route, you just saw it was red tag. You kind of knew what it was, but you're like, screw this. I'm going to attempt this anyways because I'm looking for a challenge. Is that what was going through your head?
Yeah. I think there was definitely like a bit of irreverence and cockiness at that point in my climbing. I was 16 and I had done all the hardest routes in the country and was winning international events and everything. And I just maybe a little bit short-sighted, if I look back on it and hearing Tony and Nero talk about it, that bummed him out quite a bit, and I think in the moment it felt like I couldn't resist, right? But now looking back on it, that route doesn't really mean very much to me at all. Whereas it meant a lot to him. And so, I think there's a time and a place for everything. There's a time and a place for being irreverent too. And, that's all part of the process. So in the end, it is what it is. And I've climbed a lot of other people's projects. I climbed routes like Biography. I've climbed routes, like Jumbo Love. I put some work into that as well as far as establishing it, but it was essentially Randy Levitt's vision. And I've done a lot of route development as well. And so you kind of see both sides. It's really cool. I had that amazing privilege, to climb some of those routes. And so I feel like it's been really cool to kind of like pay that forward to other climbers. So for example, with like La Dura Dura with Adam Ondra or Perfecto Mundo with Alex Megos, for example, right? It was really cool for me to kind of offer them up a route that was kind of the stepping stone for them in the next, as far as like the progression in climbing and, in a way played a role in their progression through that. And I think in the same way that all of these different people, Boom Speed, he bolted Necessary Evil, for example, and all of those routes, they contributed to my evolution, and essentially, the evolution of our sport as well. And so I think there's a time and a place for everything. And it's still an interesting subject that you could debate eternally, right or wrong. Looking back, even though I was quite the young punk, sometimes that's what it takes to move the needle in a sport or, to reinvent a new chapter in an activity like climbing, right? So when is the right time to break the mold? I don't know. Sometimes it just happens, right? But I think ultimately, there's like a lineage or like a legacy of all of these different climbers that have been a part of my journey in climbing going back, I mean, it's incredible. And I think about all these different amazing people that I've had the opportunity to climb with, and that goes back all the way into the Stone Masters, into like people like Warren Harding and Royal Robbins and everything. And so it's amazing that we're all connected to this lineage in some way or another. I think that element of establishing new routes, and whether or not you do them or not, that they become part of the evolution of our sport. And it's kind of, one of the threads that connects all of these different accomplishments and people and over time, right? It's pretty neat.
So cool hearing you talk about it too, and your influence on like Migos and Andra, and you've just been such a constant thread. Do you ever think about if you were placed in like the 70s or something before sport climbing, bouldering were really invented? Do you think you could have had more of like a big wall trad kind of path? Is that something you ever thought about? Like, what if Chris Sharma starts 20 years beforehand, Because you just started climbing when sport climbing, bouldering really were like cemented,
Yeah, that was really the context of modern climbing, was in sport climbing and bouldering. I don't know. I love trad climbing. I love climbing Yosemite, doing up to like 512 or whatever, like cracks. To be honest, like once it starts getting harder than that, I've always found it like really painful and awkward.
Totally.
And whatever, that's maybe just because I've always idolized overhanging limestone. Growing up in California and America, we were always dreaming about the steep limestone in Europe And that was always kind of like what the dreams were made out of, right? And it's interesting now that I live in Europe, so many people that I know, everyone dreams of going to Yosemite one day and climbing these beautiful splitter cracks. So it's interesting. We always kind of gravitate to what we don't have, or we always want something. The grass is always green on the other side. I don't know. I'm working on a big wall project right now. It's not really trad, but it's definitely it's a pretty impressive, 800-foot wall, and I really enjoy it. There's an element of like how much gear and logistics, how intensive it is in that sense that I think I've always been a little bit turned off by it. Like I've always loved the simplicity of bouldering, simplicity of moving on the rock, not having to think so much about the gear. Of course, that's what led me to Deepwater Southern in Mallorca as well. I'm super fired up about this big wall project. So, maybe it's all just, there's a time and a place for everything. Maybe my Yosemite chapter is still yet to be written.
You played around on the Dawn Wall for a bit, right?
I did. I went with Tommy and Kevin on the Dawn Wall. We spent a few days on it together. And I mean, it's beautiful, obviously such a stunning piece of rock. I remember trying those pitches 13 to 15 and just like right in the middle of the wall and thinking like, wow, this is a very inconvenient place to have the crux of a route, right? Like there's no easy way to access it. And I think also we were a group of 3 and it was like late November. And so, when you're in a group of 3, sometimes the person that's waiting around, like I remember getting really cold, and you got to be a smaller group to be able to be more effective. But yeah, I would someday love to go back and try that route. I think it's a really interesting route because it is kind of a hybrid sport climb. The hardest pitches on it are actually face climbing. So that's probably a route that suits sport climbers better than most routes on OCAP.
Interesting. I interviewed Tommy about it, and he said that he was very inspired by your style of just going for it, because he said he was being very meticulous and delicate about examining all the moves, and then your classic, more dynamic style inspired him. So,
well, like back in the day, didn't you ask before who inspired me? I think Tommy had a big impact on me at a young age. I met him at the junior nationals, and then like a couple weeks later, there was the national championships in San Francisco, and then from there we kind of ended up hooking up in Waco, and then going to the Virgin River Gorge. And he was already climbing 514s on rock. He was one of my first climbing partners at a young age, and it was really inspiring to get to hang out with him. I feel like that kind of showed me what was possible at a young age. To be honest, like one of the coolest experiences for me about that time on the Dawn Wall was just getting to reconnect with Tommy, because we'd both gone our separate ways, doing different things in the sport, and having that chance to go up there and be with him and support him a little bit. And it was really cool. It's kind of neat how you can kind of see each other off and on over the years. And, we've known each other for almost over 30 years, right? So it's pretty cool.
Yeah, what was your impression of how the Dawn Wall became like this worldwide phenomenon?
I think just to back up a little bit about the Dawn Wall, I remember seeing the very first video that they made for Dosage of Tommy trying it when it was still a project, and seeing the dyno pitch.
Yep.
And I was like, my mind was pretty blown, I have to say. Like I think right around that time I had climbed Espontas, or maybe that was already a couple years before. Maybe it was like 2007, something like that, 2008.
Sorry, what is it? Espontas?
Espontas is the arch in Mallorca, that deep water. So yeah, but seeing that was like, combining bouldering and sport climbing and applying that to a bigger canvas. So that was like incredibly inspiring to see Tommy doing that. And it was cool to get up and close and check it out in person. But even before that, it kind of planted the seed in me I had taken bouldering and maybe applied that to sport climbing, where you have these, harder boulder problem sequences in these sport routes, and also applied that into deep water soloing. But had never really explored that in big wall climbing. And I actually, around that same time, discovered this wall that was near where I used to live in the Pyrenees, this place in Montreux, and I found this epic wall and ended up bolting it, this hybrid sport boulder big wall thing. And it's cool. That's where I was yesterday. I'm still trying it like 14 years later.
The pictures look amazing of that.
Regarding like just the whole phenomenon of the wall, I think it's really interesting, these viral moments in our sport. In the Dawn Wall, aside from it being such an important climb in that moment, I think it was the first time that, they were doing with social media. That was really the first time that someone was reporting in real time about their experience. And that was really kind of one of the things that people started following along as they were working on it. And so I think that was maybe a part of it. When it comes to viral experiences or, events or accomplishments that go viral, it's really, I feel like, such a hard thing to put your finger on it. Why did that happen? There's a deep water solo clip of a route that I did called Black Pearl, and it's a cool clip, but I mean, it's just another one of many cool reels that we've posted over the years. And for some reason, we got like 150 million views or something. And it's interesting. I think in the end, if you live your life trying to do that, then you're never going to nail it. You got to just kind of live your life and do what motivates you. And sometimes things will resonate for some reason that you might not even understand with others. I think for me, when I climbed Espontas was an example of that. And, or maybe routes like Biography or something. I was actually talking with a friend of mine, Russ Clune, about it when that all went down with the Dawn Wall. And he was saying that was the biggest media moment for climbing since the other first descent of the Dawn Wall, when Warren Harding did the Dawn Wall.
They didn't plan for this moment to be viral, or they were just doing their thing, which I think that kind of connects to you. You've just always done your thing. You've never been a person that overly publicizes themselves. I guess I want to kind of go back to starting to do first descents, your style. Did you have some strict ethics with developing boulders and developing routes? Were you anti-chipping? Were you anti-enhancement? Were you pro-enhancement? Where does that kind of land with you when you first started developing, I guess, particularly sport climbs?
Well, I think my experience learning about development goes back to climbing in Castle Rock, where I started climbing, or the first place I really started outdoor rock climbing. And Castle Rock is a little bouldering spot in the Santa Cruz Mountains. It's pretty cool, actually. It's not a very big area, but actually has quite a bit of history. Ron Kauk also started climbing there. A lot of other climbers like John Jablonski and Scott Cosgrove, and just people. It's a in the Bay Area. So a lot of the climbers that were from around there ended up going there. That was a place where I would go with my friends from Santa Cruz, and specifically my buddy Sterling King. We would go out there and end up brushing off boulders and discovering new problems. And that's really kind of where I developed my ability to see new lines, right? And I think that's like one of the most important skills when it comes to first ascents, or, establishing new routes, is being able to look at a wall and see the features and kind of imagine the line. And so really kind of like where I learned how to do that. And then, of course, I think from there, trips like Rampage, where we were going all around the West, but living in Bishop, climbing the Buttermilks, and then ultimately going, over to Europe, climbing in Mallorca, doing deep water soloing is really where I kind of took that vision to a bigger scale, and then ended up coming here to Catalonia and started doing more route development, sport routes and stuff like that.
Kind of transitioning from, doing first ascents and, really you just had this incredibly interesting arc of being really good so fast. Where does competition climbing, fit into all of this, and how did that arc go for you? It seems like you had a time period where you did comps quite heavily and you did well, and then you had a break, and now it almost seems like you're back into it.
As I mentioned, I won the national championships when I was 14, and I won a couple of World Cups like when I was 16. I think after that, I felt like I had experienced what winning was about, what it was like. I had that experience. And for me, I was excited to move on from that and explore rock climbing. That was really what climbing was always about for me, more than competitions. It's something that I've seen happen to many different climbers over the years, where they get sucked into this cycle of competing. They're never really able to get out of it. And as a result, they've never really been able to explore their potential on the rock. Competitions it's a natural, inherent part of being human, right? If you say that you're not competitive, like, it's kind of hard to believe, right? Like, we're all competitive in some way, form or another. And, my friend Danny Andrada, he said once something that really resonated was, the people that don't compete are oftentimes the ones that are so competitive that they can't even handle being in that position where they might lose. And it's a healthy arena, to test yourself, to push yourself. There's so much camaraderie. Like I said, I've met so many amazing people through the competitions. And for me, like, I had that experience of winning. That was kind of enough at that point. But it's interesting, of course, seeing how much competition climbing has evolved in the last 30 years. I mean, it's really exciting to see everything that's going on. Of course, that climbing is an Olympic sport now. The style of setting is really, really unique, and I think is much more interesting than it was, 15, 20 years ago. 15, 20 years ago, it was more just like a pure endurance challenge. And now there's a lot of like dynamic movements, and so yeah, I'm inspired by that. I got to go to the Olympics just to be there with Team USA, and being there was just like watching those routes, like my hands were sweating because as a climber, and I'm still kind of more or less at the top of my game in some sense. I wanted to try those routes. I was like, I recently have competed a little bit, and it's interesting because I don't want to try to like relive my youth or something like that, or prove something. But, I was talking with my good friend Brett Lowell the other day. He was just visiting my house, and Brett, in the wintertime, he's doing skate skiing a lot in the gunks. And also, buddy of mine, Adam, he's an avid biker as well, cyclist. And there's something about wanting to just like know where you stand, right? My friend Brett, he's never done a competition or done a race. Same with my friend Adam, and it's just kind of an interesting thing to kind of like put yourself out there. And so yeah, it's been interesting to kind of like get my feet wet a little bit in that whole space again. And it's exciting to be a part of that. It's exciting to feel the butterflies in your stomach. Remember what those feelings are like, because when you're rock climbing, you can try these routes for an indefinite amount of time. That feeling is different, even though there are lots of nerves when you're trying your project and the whole mental challenge of that. There's something about a competition where you have to turn it on in that moment that is very intense and exciting. And I was just at this last competition, and I felt nervous, I felt nervous, but it's like, it's good to feel that, it makes you feel alive. Right. And if anything, I feel like I learned a lot from being there. And so it was cool to be there. It's a challenge because it's not something I'm prepared to take that seriously, in the sense that I'm super motivated for my climbing projects on the rock. I'm also, have a family, and have a business that I'm running as well. And so I'm not very flexible with the amount of time that I'm willing to give to that. So it's fun just to kind of dip my toe in, feel it, be a part of that, but I can't really see myself really committing to the competition circuit just for a number of reasons. But I think the time commitment. I flew out to Orlando for almost a week. And that's a week, and I had to be away from my kids. It was a great experience, but where I'm at right now, where I can kind of integrate rock climbing with my family life is pretty cool. And I think it's a challenging period of life, being in your 40s, keeping all these different balls in the air, trying to provide for your family, trying to, be present, in your relationship, being with your relationship with your kids, and also wanting to still make time for your own passions, right? It's really challenging to do all of that. And so I'm really grateful where I live. The fact that I'm still like technically a pro climber allows me to climb during the weekdays, but basically I can do like a day trip or a 2-day trip, and I get to climb on some of the best climbing areas in the world. And then I can come back home and be with my family. It's something that after doing this competition, it makes me really appreciate that I have that ability to do that. It's a challenge wanting to continue to pursue your own goals while also trying to prioritize, being a parent, right? And I felt like being gone for that long, it felt selfish in a way. Whereas if I can go for a day, like I was just out climbing yesterday, and I can come home, I can be back with my family, I'm able to kind of manage both things a little bit better, and it feels less invasive on just the overall life balance, right? With competing like that, you really do need to be all in, and even like expeditions or anything like that, it's not really the time for me. Like being here for my kids is really like a priority, and finding a balance with that is something that I'm very proud to have found. And I'm not so sure if doing the competition circuit, in some ways it is pretty cool because, there's set dates and you can, show up in these different dates. But yeah, again, I'm also too attached to rock climbing, and I have some amazing climbs that I'm working on that mean a lot to me as well. So, but it was very cool to be there and just interact and climb together with all of these younger climbers. It felt very cool. I remember being, 13, 14, 15, doing these competitions and getting to climb with my heroes that I had read about in the magazines. And it's cool to see that the other way around now, that kind of coming full circle and being the older one there. And I think it's really neat just to still be a part of climbing. It's great to just see how that whole world has developed so much. And yeah, it's pretty inspiring.
You seem like a very present person just in general about life. Is there a part of Chris Sharma that wishes the Olympics were around when you were in your prime and you could have had that chance?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I feel like I won some World Cups. I won like the X Games. I got like a silver in the World Championships when I was 15. And like I said, I experienced kind of what there was to experience. I mean, the Olympics is kind of like the ultimate stage for competitive sports, right? So without a doubt, that would have been an amazing thing to experience. So, yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. And I wish we could have seen it because I feel like you were the representative of our generation. But it's so cool that you are representing now and you've had this experience where you're still dabbling in comp climbing. You're establishing these big walls. You're still Seagull block climbing, and you also have a family. I mean, it's your arc of your career is really inspiring, and it's so cool that it's still ongoing. I'm about the same age as you, and the inspiration is really strong for me still to see someone like yourself, see someone like Tommy. It feels like it's still going, and it's been so long since the 90s.
Yeah, I mean, climbing is an amazing sport in that sense that if you stay consistent, seems like you can keep climbing at a high level for a really long time. When I started, no one really knew the lifespan of a climber, a hard high-end sport climber. And people were saying, oh, by the time you're 30, you're going to be arthritic and you won't be able to do anything. And 15 years later, I'm still feel great and feel capable of maybe climbing my hardest routes, right? And so climbing is really, really neat like that. I can say though that, whereas in the past I was able to just kind of off the cuff climb, off the couch, didn't have to really prepare very much. Like these days, I have to be much more consistent.
What does that look like for you with your preparation and your training right now?
I never really trained, but just in general, I try to climb frequently, whether that's sport climbing or having a bouldering session on the kilter board at the gym or whatever. But be consistent is like the most important thing. And sometimes you take a week off and it's amazing. It's like the best thing that you could do for yourself, or even 2 weeks. But in general, I find that it's important to be just more consistent, especially with endurance. I think one of the most painful things is getting route climbing endurance again. That feeling of just melting off of a huge jug. It's almost like a humiliating feeling. You're like, why am I not able to hold on to this thing? And I think one quote that I've always loved from Conrad Anker, when someone asked him what he did to stay in shape, and he said, by not getting out of shape. And that's definitely true for me. Like just trying to staying at a consistent high level. And you might fluctuate a little bit here and there throughout the year, but climbing really has like become my practice. It's like a martial arts or like a yoga practice. It's something, of course, you're always working towards a goal, but most of the time you don't actually achieve anything. You're just going through the motions of trying and working towards that and perfecting your craft. And it really is kind of a never-ending process. And so, yeah, just always trying to stay somewhat in shape. Like these days I'm climbing, I would say 3 days a week on average, and knock on wood, but I've been able to stay pretty injury-free and feeling good, feeling strong. So I'm very grateful, very, very psyched. So
one of your quotes that I can't remember where I picked this out of, I'm rarely successful. It's rare that I'm successful in a climb, that you're just constantly in this cycle of trying.
One of the things that I've thought and said to people at times is like, if you're doing things regularly, then maybe you need to be trying harder things, right? I think it's good to have, some long-term goals, some mid-term goals, and some short-term goals. It's good to have some routes that you could do relatively quickly, or go out and try to on-site some climbs, and to remember what it's like to succeed. Because sometimes when we're only trying hard projects, we actually forget how to red point something. We're always failing all the time. And it is important to do some routes from time to time. But I think the really interesting space to play in is when you're trying something that really pushes you to grow as a climber, to improve. And that's the space where you have to kind of dream and push your boundaries, right? And so that's what's always inspired me, is finding something that's just beyond reach, right? You end up spending lots of time falling.
What climb represents that for you now? Do you have multiple projects that are just out of reach, or are the culmination of all your efforts? You mentioned the Big Wall project in Spain. Tell us a little bit about what Chris Sharma is reaching for now.
Yeah, well, that Big Wall project, I think it's like 11 plus first pitch. Second pitch is a 15A. Third pitch is a 14A. Fourth pitch is like 14D. Fifth pitch is about 14B. Sixth pitch is like 12 plus. And then the last pitch is like maybe 14C. So it's pretty ambitious, amazing route.
And you bolted this thing yourself?
I bolted this. Yeah, I bolted it about 14 years ago, and ended up actually getting, someone chuffed it a couple of years ago and ended up having to reestablish it. It was a whole story in and of itself.
Because I ground up after.
I had bolted it ground up back in the day, but I had used removable bolts. I was really seeking out a futuristic line. and was going up into these overhanging sections of rock. You're not even sure if it's possible or not. And so ended up placing some removable bolts. And so some of the locals, they didn't like that. And anyway, somebody came and chopped it. We went back and forth. This was just a couple of years ago, back and forth. We ended up debating it, with some of the Spanish magazines here, and ended up coming to the agreement where if I go back and bolt it the pure way, then that would be acceptable to them. And so I went up and climbed and aided my way up, hooking and climbing to bolt it. So yeah, now I've been trying this thing for about 14 years. I had to bolt it twice. And so now I'm like, all right, let's try to seal the deal here. So we'll see if I can make it happen.
Did that test your chill? Like Chris Sharma's famous chill, did that experience test you in a way? Or how did you react to all that?
Yeah, it did. It did a little bit. And it's funny, I come across as super chill, but if you've seen all the things that I've done, you gotta imagine that there's a side of me that's got that burning flame inside, right? Like I'm also like motivated and ambitious in the things that I set my mind to. So yeah, I remember walking out feeling pretty bummed. And then as I was walking out, I was like, well, like I don't want to let that get the best of me. Like it actually kind of lit the fire a little bit, not in a negative sense, but I was like, I'm gonna try to use this as fuel, light the fire a little bit to make this happen. I took it as like a test to test how much do I really want to do this, right? We're able to transform this moment into a bit of a healing experience, a reconciliation away in a sense of, these different factions within climbing. This place, Montre Bay, where my route is a kind of like a bastion of like trad climbing. And so you have extreme ideas about how things should be. Of course, Spain has so much sport climbing, so they're kind of very protective of that. And it was really great through dialogue, talking with people and trying to find common ground. The person that chopped it never came forward. That was the kind of part that was kind of offensive, I feel like, for everybody, because in the end, there's going to be disagreements, but how you handle those situations really is like how things become defined. And ultimately, talking things through and keeping in mind the fact that we're all climbers, that we're actually passionate about the same thing. And of course, there are differences how a route is going to be put up, but we're able to kind of like flip it around and turn it into a positive experience. I feel like I said, it actually kind of tested me. How much do I really want to do this? And, taking that initiative to go back and rebolt it ground up, climbing through all the sequences, it really remotivated me to climb this route. So it adds another layer to the story.
Absolutely, man. Is this going to be part of a film or anything? Have you been filming this?
We've been filming a bit of it. Yeah, when I start getting closer, I think we definitely will start filming more. But I've been working up all of the sections, just a lot of days out there. I ran the 15A pitch last fall, and I have 2 more pitches that I have to red point to have all of the route climbed, and then the idea is to climb it in a single push. So it's really cool because this place is so beautiful. Every time I go out there, it's like a mini expedition to get there. It's over a river, so you have to kayak in to get there. And then of course, you Jumar up, hundreds of feet, and you're up on this wall. It's such a spectacular place. It really is, I think, the most beautiful place in all of Catalonia. And yeah, I'm able to have this amazing experience in the mountains for the day, and then I drive home and then I'm back with my family. And so I'm really grateful to have this variety of, types of climbing relatively close to where I live, so I know I'm very fortunate, and a lot of people don't have that opportunity. But I also remember living in Santa Cruz and, these little rinky-dink bouldering walls that we would find out in the forest, and we would make up these traverses. And really, like, with your attitude, you can convert anything into an amazing experience, right? I remember some of the best days climbing, just being on these like random, dirty traverse walls in Santa Cruz in the hills. And you could be in the most amazing place in the world. And if you have a bad attitude, you're going to convert that place into a terrible place to be, and vice versa. If you're psyched, you're with a good group of people, you convert that place into this amazing spot, even if you're just making up eliminate problems. But ultimately, it's great that if we can make some great climbing trips happen, sometimes throughout the year, I think it's really good for everyone out there who's listening. It's like, set a goal. Like, I'm going to go to Yosemite, or I'm going to go to Red River Gorge, or I'm going to come climb in Waco, or wherever it is, right? To have a couple of those, like, things that are going to like keep you psyched throughout the whole year. But the day in, day out, day to day life of climbing is so much about milking your local areas. And I really feel that I'm more locked into one area because of family and responsibilities. In the past, I could travel wherever I wanted. And I think that's a kind of a fantasy life it's an amazing lifestyle when you can do that, but it's not very practical or sustainable. So like, I think for the majority of the people, it comes down to milking your local spots. And, that core group of friends that you have, that you meet up, a couple times a week, even just at the gym, right? That really is like where the lifeblood of our climbing experience happens. And so I used to be just like this total globetrotter, but now I climb mostly just around home.
I love that. Well, I have a million more things I could ask you about, but I really appreciate you taking this hour with me and the persistence to get it done. Yeah, I didn't say this at the top, but if I had to pick one climber ever that is my favorite, it's you. All right, that was my conversation with Chris Sharma. Like I said, that was a true joy for me as a fan, and just, as a host, it was a good lesson that you always get to know someone if you don't know them before. Even if you do, just having a long, intentional conversation really gets to the heart of things. So thank Chris for making the time for that. I was in Mexico, he was in Spain. We negotiated the time difference and everything, and got to have that great conversation. As I said at the top, Volume 26 is off the press. It's a 164-page masterpiece with some really, really great contributors: Marcus Garcia, Garrett Dickinson, Lindsay Platt, Paul Trowbridge, Ling Lu Zhou, Rowan Waller, Carly Rager, Josh Smith, Madeline Pierce, Devin Dabney, Chris Schulte, Cliff Cash, and yours truly, Luke Mehall, and some great photography and art in there as well. So be sure to pick up a copy at shop.climbingzine.com. And the best thing to do is subscribe, and that's an auto-renew subscription, so you can just subscribe one time and forget about it until your credit card expires, and I'll remind you. And we've also got some new Send Your Face shirts if you're into that. And we've got some new Dirtbag State of Mind with our revised OG design, kind of with that blood red sunset. So we've got that on stickers, shirts, and hoodies. And the Send Your Face, we've got some new tie-dye shirts in short sleeve and long sleeve. So check all that out at shop.climbingzine.com. Music for this episode is by Devin Dabney. Our digital editor and producer is Chad Rich. And signing off from Springtime in Durango, Colorado, I'm Luke Mehall. Peace.